about 1 in 3 women leak from the bladder, about 1 in 2 to 1 in 6 women have a prolapse, and 1 in 10 women have fecal incontinence. A lot of people, they don't need to do endless Kegels till the cows come home.
I think that's something that we really need to cut the BS on. Kegels are not the answer.
I thought I knew a bit about pelvic health, and I've just realised I know nothing from that.
And today we have with us Gipson, who is a specialist pelvic health physiotherapist working with men and women who have any kind of pelvic floor dysfunction.
And that's really interesting is Kegel balls. This was really common around like after 50 Shades of Grey because you can use them during sex and it's all quite naughty.
Probably experienced more women farting with me in a jiu-jitsu class than I ever have in normal day-to-day life.
They dismiss stuff because all their friends have it. It's talked about as being normal, but it's not normal.
It's never too late. So lots of people come and say, I had my baby 8 years ago. It must be too late for me now. And that's just not true.
There'll be a massive problem with waist trainers as well.
Waist trainers are my pet hate. Because...
Hi, I'm Jamie.
And I'm Stacey.
And this is the BodySmartPodcast.
And today we have with us Gipson, who is a specialist pelvic health physiotherapist working with men and women who have any kind of pelvic floor dysfunction. So thank you so much for coming down, and we're excited to be cutting so much BS today because this is a subject that people often kind of pussyfoot around, and we're going to just throw the door wide open, talk about all of the things. So we're going to be covering the broad range of pelvic floor dysfunctions, and that includes things like painful sex, leaking whilst running, jumping, skipping, prolapse. There's just so many things that fall under this umbrella. So I guess that's where we could start. Like, what even is pelvic floor dysfunction?
So I think it's really important to think about the pelvic floor muscles themselves. So whenever we talk about a dysfunction in the pelvis, it's normally related to the muscles in some way or another. So the pelvic floor muscles are a sling or hammock of muscles that sit at the bottom of the pelvis, exactly as they sound like. So they go from the pubic bone at the front all the way underneath towards the tailbone and then out to both sit bones. So that means that if you think about your own anatomy, they're actually quite big muscles. They're much bigger than we picture. And they're important for lots of different things. So the first thing they do is they wrap around the bladder and around the bowel, and they control when we go to the toilet. So they contract so that nothing comes out when we don't want it to, and then they relax so that we can fully empty the bowel, fully empty the bladder without having to strain or push. They're really important for vaginal control. So they basically relax to allow things in, whether that's a tampon or a partner or a speculum. They also relax to allow a baby out, and then they contract during intercourse to contribute towards climax. That's what makes sex fun. So really important for that as well. And then the thing that often people forget is they're really, really important for our core system or our abdominal system. So they work with our abdominal wall and our back muscles and our breathing muscles, our diaphragm at the top, to mean that we can manage pressure in that whole system so that when we jump or laugh or run or we pick heavy weights or throw our children above our head or go on a trampoline, we can manage that pressure so that our organs are really well supported from underneath, we're really strong from the front, and also nothing comes out that we don't want it to. So really, really important muscles. So if that's sort of what happens when they're working well, then when we think about what a dysfunction is when those things aren't happening. So we can have problems with the bladder, things like leaking, urgency, rushing to go for a wee, feeling like you need a wee all the time, or difficulty emptying the bladder. It might be things like constipation or struggling to control wind, or having problems with intimacy, whether that is pain with sex or that sex is just a bit unsatisfying or find it very difficult to climax. So all of those things can contribute towards sort of the whole broad spectrum of pelvic floor problems.
Wow.
And I think it's really interesting that you've covered that broad range, because there's a common misconception that it's just something that you only have to worry about when you've had a baby, which is not the case.
Well, I thought I knew a bit about pelvic health, and I've just realised I know nothing from that. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like I do know quite a bit, but like that was it's very connective across of so many different parts of your whole body.
Very much so, very much so. And I think there's this new sort of pattern that people think that because we're talking about the menopause, we're talking about postnatal, that now people know about it and we can all laugh about it, and it's become quite normalised. You see all these awful cards in Sainsbury's saying things like, I laughed so hard that the tears ran down my leg, and everyone's like, ha. Yeah. And I'm like, that's not really funny though, is it? Like, there's lots we can do. And so it's really important that we start to spread the word a bit about what should be going on, what symptoms there might be if things aren't working quite so well, and when should you get a bit more support and who that might come from.
Yeah, I think a really helpful phrase, and you said it yesterday, was it's common, but it's not normal.
Yes.
And that's something that I think we see a lot with clients is they dismiss stuff because all their friends have it. It's talked about as being normal, but it's not normal. Like it's not healthy, normal function of your body.
Absolutely. It is really common, and there's certain times in our lives when it's more common. So we know that around pregnancy and around birth and the postnatal period, there might be more changes to the pelvic floor. Similarly around perimenopause. And we know that actually there's quite a high prevalence of pelvic floor dysfunction. So about 1 in 3 women leak from the bladder. About 1 in 2 to 1 in 6, depending on what research you read, women have a prolapse where the organ sits lower within the pelvis, and 1 in 10 women have fecal incontinence, so difficulty controlling either wind or their bowels. And so when we think about how many people is that when you look around the gym or in your F45 class, it's a lot of people.
Yep.
That doesn't mean that we can say, oh, it's fine, we just put up with it. But what it does show is that actually there needs to be so much more awareness and support, because actually this is really, really common, and there's so much we can do about it. And people live for years and years and years and years with these problems. No one's asking them about it. Everyone's just laughing about it, maybe if they're confident enough to tell their friends, but not actually doing anything. But the research shows that for most of these symptoms, actually a very short period of time, maybe even just 12 weeks of pelvic health physiotherapy, whether that's pelvic floor training, whether that's bladder retraining, we can have a huge impact and get people dry and able to do all the things they want to do, and they can just get on with their lives. They don't need to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas waiting all this time and saying, oh, no, I can't lift that weight, or I can't do double unders, or I actually don't think that I can do that diet because it's going to cause constipation. But is that the problem?
Yeah.
Probably not. And actually, if we can get people able to do all these things, then they can start living their actual life rather than worrying about their problems with their pelvis.
So you said 12 weeks there. Where does someone really start then if they were like, hey, this sounds like me, I am having pelvic floor issues? Where would be like the first place for somebody to start in terms of taking action to see some sort of results over the next 12 weeks?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it depends what the problem is. The most important thing is to always make sure you're seeing the right person. So if you've got a worry about your bladder, about your bowel, any problems with sort of any vaginal symptoms or problems with sex, then most people will start with their GP. So you can go to your GP, or they can refer you across. They can rule out there's nothing sinister going on, and they can refer you across to an NHS pelvic health physiotherapist, so someone like me. So what physios do is we look at the pelvic floor muscles themselves. We look at bladder function, bowel function, all of the different things we've just discussed, and we work out what's going on with those muscles. So sometimes those muscles can be that they're working really well. So if we think about the pelvic floor like any other muscle, it needs to be able to be strong. So it needs to have enough power for the activity that you want to do. So if you want to lift 30 kg above your head, that's a very different ask for the pelvic floor than having a cough. It needs to have endurance. So it needs to be able to be strong enough for as long as you need it to be strong for, depending on the activity. And it needs to be coordinated. So whatever you want to do, it needs to work at the right time. So for example, stress incontinence, when people have leaking, when the pressure in their tummy goes up, often with coughing, laughing, sneezing, lifting things, the pelvic floor is often strong enough. It's just turning on a few milliseconds too late. And if we can work on that coordination, then actually they don't need to do endless Kegels till the cows come home. They can just actually get that timing right, and then the leaking stops. But the other thing that is a huge misconception is that everybody thinks that pelvic floor problems are because of weakness. But probably about 50, I'd maybe say even more, % of the people I see have an overactive pelvic floor. So they can't actually relax the muscle. And if you can't relax the muscle, then it becomes tense. Then it makes it a lot harder. You can't turn a muscle on that's already on. So that can contribute towards that leaking. So that's why seeing the right people, getting your pelvic floor checked by a specialist, getting a really good assessment and working out where are you, to make sure that whatever treatment plan you go on to, whether that is pelvic floor muscle training or bladder retraining or bowel retraining or modifying your form for an exercise, that we actually know what's caused the problem, because everything can't just be treated with Kegels, which I think Instagram would love us to believe.
Yeah, I think that's something that we really need to cut the BS on. Kegels are not the answer to everything.
They're not the answer for many things, if I'm honest.
Could you explain what Kegels are for anyone who doesn't know?
And I am just going to say, someone in the office earlier was like, do you think she's going to demonstrate Kegels? And I was like, that would be quite hard.
Well, I could, but you wouldn't see anything.
Yeah.
So a Kegel, it just means a pelvic floor muscle contraction. So back ages ago, there was some research that showed that if you get that muscle stronger through doing contractions, then that can help some things. Quite a lot of research has come out now to show that nearly all the problems that initially they said would help. Stress incontinence, prolapse, fecal incontinence. Actually, Kegels by themselves don't make that much difference. But if you have a weak pelvic floor, we can consider it similar to doing bicep curls if you've got weak biceps, in that it will make the muscle stronger. Doing a Kegel literally just means contracting the pelvic floor. So if you were going to try and contract the pelvic floor, you would squeeze around the back passage as if you were trying to hold in wind or trying to hold in a fart, and then pull up around the front as if you're trying to stop the flow of urine. And then you'd relax all the way back down again. And if I was to do one, you wouldn't be able to see anything. My tummy shouldn't be squeezing, my buttocks shouldn't be squeezing, I shouldn't be holding my breath. And it would just be literally a squeeze and a let go. That's all a Kegel is. The challenge with Kegels on Instagram, and not just Instagram, Dr. Google is just as bad, is that everybody tries to do this squeeze that they can't see, they've got no feedback for, are often doing the wrong thing. They might actually be bearing down rather than squeezing, which can contribute towards worsening symptoms. And if your muscles are already too tight, squeezing lots and lots and lots isn't going to help. Equally, if we go back to bicep curls, if I want to be able to lift my child out of the cot and then hold it or carry it around, and my arms aren't strong enough, just doing bicep curls isn't going to work either. Yes, I need to train biceps, but I also need to do compound movements so that I'm strong everywhere. And just doing pelvic floor squeezes is kind of like just doing bicep curls to have a strong upper body. It's not functional. And they're often taught to do lying down, and then they think, right, you've done your lying down Kegels, you can run now.
Yes, this was something that was massive for me when I had a pelvic organ prolapse after I had my son. And the NHS physio said, just do your Kegels 3 times a day. And I did them and nothing really changed. And then I went to see another pelvic floor physio, and she was like, okay, now do a lunge position and do them. Now do a squat position and do them. Now do them when you're standing up, when you're doing other things with your arms. And I was like, why didn't I think of this? Like, I should understand this. I should know this. I'm not asking my pelvic floor to work for me when I'm led in bed. It does. I'm asking it to work when I'm doing other stuff. And so I need to train it when I'm doing other stuff.
Yeah. And I think as well, because the pelvic floor is like so mystified and only specialists treat it, and it's like niche,
right,
even though everybody has a pelvic floor.
Even men.
It means that people sort of forget that actually to be able to run, I think running's such a good example, you actually need to be able to have balance on one leg. You need to be able to absorb impact. You have to be strong enough in your glutes and your hamstrings and the whole posterior chain. You have to be able to breathe well. You have to be able to rotate through your thorax. And the pelvis is the middle of all of those movements. So if anything else isn't working well, if you've got like a really altered biomechanics on one leg because of a previous ankle injury, and that ankle is really unstable or it doesn't have the stability around it, then the tension is going to, and the stability has to come from somewhere. So is it going to come from your knee? Probably not, because it's in the middle of the leg. Is it going to come from somewhere that's a bit bulkier? Probably yes. So if you have a really, really weak ankle or poor balance, or really, you're really bracing and gripping through your tummy, it might be that if we just get your balance better, then your pelvic floor doesn't have to work quite so hard, and then actually it can just have its normal function. So I think sometimes pelvic health has become a bit that pelvic health physios specialise in the pelvis, and then musculoskeletal physios focus on everything else, and then PTs just do the rehab after. Whereas actually your pelvic health physio should be looking at stability, balance, general strength, breathing, what's your rib position like. Your MSK physio should be asking, how are you getting on with your pelvis? Your PT should be saying, before we get you doing box jumps, is there anything you're worried about doing in terms of this? Are you worried about leaking? Do you have any problems with your pelvic floor? Is that something you'd be happy to discuss with me?
Yeah. But they're all like idealistics, aren't they? You know what I mean? Like, I would love it if every personal trainer would go to that level of empathy and compassion and take those sort of steps. There's a couple of things that you've said, and just because at least it interested me, is like you're saying people are contracting all the time, but are still getting leaking. So, but why is that? Because if you're contracting, you would think that would stop. Is it just because there's so much pressure there all the time?
Yeah, there's 2 main reasons why that's a problem. One is fatigue. If you think about any muscle, if you try and have it on all the time, it's not going to have that stability. But the other thing is that if that muscle is tense, it then can't create more support for the activity that you need. So it's all to do with pressure. So we need the pressure at the base of the bladder to be higher than in the bladder. And then if that happens, nothing will come out. Yeah. But if you're sort of half squeezed all the time, but can't access more of a squeeze, then when you land or when you jump or when you cough, there's nothing more to give because that muscle is already in that tense state. But the other side of things is that we know that
do you think that comes from just the fear of leaking? So you're like where that comes from. Like I feel like I'm going to leak, so I'm just going to tense all the time.
Yeah.
And then that causes this to happen.
So that can cause a big problem. So fear of leaking, fear of incontinence of the bladder and the bowel can cause a lot of tension. But tension can come for lots of different reasons. So it might be because there's weakness elsewhere and it's compensating. So it might be a biomechanical problem. It might also be because of a history of trauma, that actually people who carry more tension in their pelvis if they've got a history of physical or emotional trauma.
Yeah.
But also some people are more tense body types in general. We know some people are really bendy and quite relaxed, and some people are more sort of stiff, short body types, and that can influence. A big thing I see all the time is people gripping their tummy on all day. I think it's more prevalent in women, but I see it a lot in men, especially men who are more lean and they want to sort of maintain that aesthetic of being a bigger up top, but quite lean in the middle, so that they're holding on all the time. And all that's doing is pushing so much pressure down onto that pelvic floor that the pelvic floor is fighting back all day. And so then when you go for a run, when you try and lift, it's already tense because it's trying to manage all of that pressure in your tummy all the time.
Yeah.
And so actually one of the first things I tell nearly everybody to do, irrelevant of if their pelvic floor is weak or tight or not well coordinated, is let go of your tummy throughout the day, let go of your jaw throughout the day. So there's a really big connection between your jaw and your pelvic floor from when you're in the embryo. And if you've got a tight jaw, you've got a tight pelvic floor.
This is actually really cool. And this is something as a yoga teacher I used to get people to do, because if you try it now, if you like tense your jaw, like crunch your tongue up and like take your attention to your pelvic floor and then release it, you're like, oh, it changed. And I didn't change my pelvic floor. What? And like that tension through your whole body is just, it just carries through, right?
Is that often coming through just like a state of stress? Because like there are certain things that people do when they're stressed. They hold the breath, they tense up, you know, and you can feel like that. Like if you're in like a stressful environment in the workplace, you can almost like brace and hold all day in essence. And
so you're then causing that tension all day without, it's not because you're worried about weeing.
Yeah.
You're just stressed.
I think in the pelvic floor, everyone's always quite keen to say that is caused by that. We want it to be really simple. But it tends to be in the pelvis. There's so many things going on. We've got the biomechanics of the tailbone, of the hips, of the back. We've got the pelvic floor itself. We've got management of that intra-abdominal pressure. We've got the abdominal wall. We've got the way we breathe. Then we've got if you're more constipated, if the bladder's full, if it's not full, where are you in your cycle? That's going to change the position of the cervix. There's so many things going on that often women come and say, well, can you pinpoint for me exactly why when I did my 25th double under, I leaked then? And I'm kind of like, right, well, we can definitely break it down and talk about all the different factors that might have contributed. But sometimes looking for this silver bullet isn't that helpful, and working out, okay, well, how can we get you generally less tense in your whole body? Can we then transform that into your pelvic floor muscles? And then how does that feel when you run? Do you suddenly realize that as soon as you run, or let's say as soon as you pick up a weight, is everything automatically going back to gripping your tummy, gripping your jaw, everything's on? And I think that's why a really interesting topic is about bracing during heavy lifts.
Yeah.
Yes, can we please dig into this? Because this is something that I really struggled with even before I had kids. I had pelvic floor issues with heavy lifts. And I'm not going to lie, it's still an issue as much as I work on it. It's super hard and super complicated. So if you can find a simple way, I'll be very grateful.
So I think when people talk about heavy lifts, people have got different bracing strategies, and depending on sort of what people you follow and what sort of ways you lift will depend on how you brace. But there's quite a lot of people who, if they're going to lift heavy, will intentionally push their tummy out, brace their tummy so they've got all this intra-abdominal pressure, flat back, and then they will hold their breath so their diaphragm is splinted so that everything is not going to change. And that helps us lift really heavy. So if you want to lift really, really, really heavy, like I'm talking Olympic lifts in competition, it might be that you have to consider that sort of strategy. But when you do that kind of lift and that kind of brace, you have to think, well, where is all that pressure going? Because it's going somewhere. And if you've splintered your diaphragm with a breath hold, you've splintered your abdominals by bracing, pushing your tummy out and trying to make that tummy tense, and you've got no idea what's going on with your pelvic floor, is it surprising that all that pressure is therefore going to go down? Then you're going to have symptoms of leaking or heaviness or pelvic pain. So thinking about how you actually manage that pressure. So a really common way that I get most people to lift if they don't have problems with overactivity of their pelvic floor is actually get set up in the position that you're going to, so take the slack out of the bar or get yourself ready, and then think about actually engaging the pelvic floor first. You've got support from the bottom. engaging the abdominal wall with a contraction rather than a brace. So really thinking about drawing those hips together, drawing the waist together, getting those deep abdominals working. And then as you do the movement, exhale, because then the pressure is going to be coming from the top rather than pushing down towards the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why things like ab belts and all these things are really problematic from a pelvic floor perspective.
Right.
And often it's a tricky one because
because they're masking the problem.
Well, because what people do is they have all that pressure even more so pushed down, because if you can't manage the pressure without the belt, you definitely can't manage it with the belt from a physiological perspective. So yes, you can lift heavier, but again, where's all that pressure going?
So you could also see where there would be a massive problem with waist trainers as well.
Absolutely. Waist trainers are my pet hate. Because the thing is, they don't really train your waist.
It's a bit of a weird name, isn't
it?
They
don't really train anything.
They don't train anything. And the problem with them is that they sort of encourage you to suck your tummy in, which is the opposite of what we want for a happy pelvis. They encourage us to breath hold because we can't get that good rib expansion as we breathe. And then they encourage us to move around in this really tense, really uncomfy state all day. And again, all of that pressure, if you think about your tummy like a balloon, if we're squeezing anywhere in the balloon, we can work out where the pressure's going. So if we're squeezing from underneath with the pelvic floor, the pressure's going to go up. Great. Our diaphragm is flexible. We can breathe. Great place for pressure to go. If we are doing something which allows our tummy to relax, so if we're walking around, we don't need a gripped on tummy, we can have a nice relaxed tummy. So if we squeeze underneath, it can come out our tummy. If we're squeezing the middle, it's going to go down. And again, that's going to contribute towards pelvic floor problems, because the pelvic floor will either get really tired and all the fascia and connective tissue gets stretched, and that can contribute towards prolapse, or the pelvic floor is going to fight back and it's going to say, right, there's loads of pressure here. Let's get really tight so we can protect our organ position against all that pressure. So waist trainers and me aren't really friends.
How about, because this is like big in the bodybuilding side of things, which is stomach vacuums. Have you heard of them before?
Yes. Is that like in yoga when you go like that?
So it's basically like where you would suck in your stomach as much as you could, and you would then hold your
like
waist.
hyperpressives.
At the smallest amount, and you would try and hold that for about 30 seconds, and you would do like 4 or 5 sets of 30 seconds. But you are literally like, and it's like you're trying to get your waist as small as you can, but it's more...
It's like training your TVA.
Yeah.
It's like for a purpose, not to be skinny.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one. So hyperpressives are used a lot for women with prolapse, because the idea is that if you do them in the right way, so you create that negative pressure within the abdomen, then that's going to take the pressure off the organs. The research kind of is really mixed. Some say it makes no difference. A few say it makes it worse. Some say it's absolutely fantastic. And you'll see lots of pelvic health physios who use hyperpressives. The problem with hyperpressives is that I would never, ever, ever recommend anybody to do them unless they actually have done one during a vaginal examination with someone who knows what's happening with the pelvic floor.
Right.
Because if you don't know what you're doing, it might look perfect, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the pressure is actually being managed well. And the risk with it is that although you're trying to create that upward vacuum, lots of people actually end up just bearing down. And then that's going to put loads of pressure onto the pelvic floor. And if you don't know what's happening down there, then how do you know what's actually going on in the pelvis? So I'm not anti them if they are really well supervised with a pelvic floor physio, and you know that it's definitely something that's helping you, but it's definitely not the first thing I would go to.
It's also something that I found, when you say you don't know if you're doing it properly, because it looks like breathing in, but breathing in actually means that you have expansion in your belly.
Exactly.
It creates a lot of confusion in my experience.
Very much so. And I think it's such a complicated thing to do that is really hard to get right, that is often taught really badly. And there's so many really easy things we can do. Why would we go to the hard stuff when actually we can do really easy things to get the bladder working well, the bowel working well, the pelvic floor working well, getting you feeling strong, empowered to move? Why would we get you watching YouTube videos, or you're in the gym trying to do this thing which looks a certain way, which you can't really feel, which no one can really check, that you don't know if it's working? I think it's potentially putting you on a path of lots of confusion when it's not necessarily a tool that everybody needs.
And it's actually super hard to do.
It's really difficult, yeah.
So if you've seen it on Instagram or you've seen it online and you're trying to do it, it must be so frustrating.
To do stomach vacuums to this?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've done them for like periods of time, and they are difficult, and you have to do it for a very long period of time to start seeing like significant progress.
And it's the coordination actually that's required. And I don't think that's a bad thing. So there is like a yoga kriya called Nauli, which is where you create the vacuum and then you like make your stomach go swelly welly. And it's really cool.
Swelly welly.
Yeah, I'll show you later.
Very technical.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah.
But like the coordination required to be able to achieve that, like if your muscles can do that, then you're in a good place. But if you look at somebody online and cool, I'm going to try and learn how to do that, it's just not going to happen, right? It takes years.
I think as well, we've got to think about like, what is the goal? So if your goal is that you want to be able to do it because it's an achievement, it's something you want to be able to try, you're interested in it, you're curious about it, fine. If you want to do it because you need to for work, also fine. If you want to have a happy pelvis, no pelvic floor dysfunction, no symptoms, able to go about your life, train, do all the things you want to do you need it? Probably not.
I know you've mentioned a couple of times here about men having pelvic floor issues.
Yes.
I do not know one guy that has pelvic floor issues. And that's probably because if they do, they don't tell me. And men are typically not as sharing as women. And obviously I've spent a lot more time with women and we coach women, so I hear a lot more around these type of issues. But is this something that's prolific in men?
Yeah, about 50% of my clients are men.
Wow.
So the men's pelvic floor is actually anatomically so similar to a female pelvic floor. The main difference is that the pelvic floor in men controls erections. So it relaxes to allow blood to go into the penis and then contracts to keep it there. And then after ejaculation, it relaxes so the blood can go back in. Interestingly, the same thing happens to women in the clitoris. So actually, it's not that different. The main other reason from a pelvic floor perspective is that men have different problems to women because they don't have childbirth. So although childbirth is not to account for all problems with the pelvic floor, we do see a lot that's why women talk about it, the perimenopause, pregnancy, that sort of part of a woman's life. Whereas in men, there's two main reasons why it would be. One is like a biomechanical reason, so poor pressure management, carrying lots of tension. We see lots and lots of men with pelvic pain, whether that's specific in a location such as around the back passage, often at the tip of the penis or at the base of the testicles as a sign of pudendal nerve. So that's a really common area of pain. But also they might have symptoms of constipation because of that overactivity. They can't get anything out. But the other time that we see a problem with men is after they have their prostate removed. Because if it's because of an enlarged prostate or because of cancer, if they take the prostate away, there can be nerve damage to the pelvic floor and also structural damage to some of the sphincters around the pelvic floor. So they often have loads of problems with large volumes of urinary incontinence and erectile dysfunction. So if we train the pelvic floor really specifically, then actually we can have really, really good outcomes, both for pelvic pain and also for post-prostatectomy. I see loads of male cyclists. It's huge in cycling.
Oh, why is that?
Partly because of being in such a prolonged position for a long period of time, in excessive hip flexion, also really tense on the bike, especially if they've got problems with their saddle, so they're sort of avoiding tension. Also, if they're working really hard, they don't breathe that well on the bike, because if you think sort of it's very hard to get your belly to relax whilst you're on the bike to breathe well.
Yeah, and you're
really contracted through here. So it means it's a lot more difficult to actually have a happy pelvic floor. And if we're honest, if we were really to look at the population of male cyclists, they also tend to be slightly more type A. They carry a bit more tension anyway, more tension in their jaw. They're often male cyclists can be sort of more high-flying men, especially if you look in the big cities. Is there a way to get a bit of stress relief? So there's that whole combination which can lead to a lot of pelvic floor overactivity. And that can lead to, things like pelvic pain and erectile dysfunction. So when we get all of that working well, then it means that most of those symptoms can resolve.
That's really interesting. I don't even think like most guys would say if they had issues with like erectile dysfunction or anything else, they would go, oh, it's my pelvic floor.
No,
you know
I think that's actually a really enlightening viewpoint that maybe people haven't considered, because there's drugs for it, right? Or that's what potentially the GP would answer with as well, not let's get you to see a physio.
But I think as well that it's a really complex issue, and especially most of the men that I treat are really young. They're not, it might be in their 20s.
An age side of it.
Most in their 20s. And it's often quite a complex issue. I mean, let's be honest, erectile dysfunction is really psychological as well as a biomechanical and physiological thing. So addressing all those factors is really important. But I think the biggest challenge is that men don't talk about it. There's quite a lot of research about crossfitters, male crossfitters, and flatus incontinence, so like not being able to control wind during heavy lifts. And actually people don't talk about it because it's embarrassing, but then actually it's happening all the time. If you're lifting really heavy, you don't look after your pelvic floor, then it's like...
Jiu-jitsu is the worst for this.
Is it?
Well, you think about it, like you might... the amount of times people have like just farted loud as hell in class because you maybe have got somebody like on top of you and you're like hip thrusting them off at like 100% capacity trying to get someone off and just Off you go.
There
So
we
yeah,
go.
I've probably experienced more women farting in front of me in a jiu-jitsu class than I ever have in normal day-to-day life.
That's
Yeah,
not
specific
overly
example.
surprising. But
It's not, but like you think about it, like you're fighting or
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
rolling to an extent, and you're in these extremely braced positions, and then
Yeah.
you're trying to get someone off, and an opportunity comes, and you look at the opportunity and probably try and get that person off you or roll them off you. You're probably thinking more about that than maybe bracing to hold.
And
a bit of
actually,
wind in,
if
a
your
bit of
pelvic
gas.
floor is working as it should, you shouldn't have to think about bracing it. That's the
Exactly.
point. So that's a dysfunctional pelvic floor.
Very
Because
much
you
so.
don't think, oh, I'm going to stand up and pick up something off the floor. I better engage my glutes and squeeze my legs. Like, you just get up and pick it off the floor.
Yeah.
And that's a really good example of, I don't know many men, I don't think I know any men with pelvic floor dysfunction, but they can't control wind in jiu-jitsu. So they have pelvic floor dysfunction. So
Yeah.
when we talk about normalizing it, it's a really good example actually of like, if you look at like buggy fit classes and mums running with their buggies, but they won't wear grey leggings. Or, there's so many things which we say, oh, no, that's fine. Or so many women come and see me and I say, do you have any problems with leaking? And I'm like, oh, they're like, no. And I'm like, fantastic. Would you get on a trampoline? Oh, no, I wouldn't. Okay, so there's a problem with leaking.
Yeah. I mean, I've had so many clients. When I was worked as a personal trainer, I was in person. I would be one of the first things I'd ask, like, are we okay to jump, to do this, to do that? And sometimes it was like, maybe. And I did have this one lady who was doing box jumps in a class and just completely like wet herself. So, and it was bad. Like, she didn't even notice that it happened. I had to like tell her. So then I just like threw my bottle of water over me and just walked down to the toilet. I was just like, oh, we were just had a water fight. And you're like, what? But it was just like an easy way of getting around it for her.
Yeah.
And like, that was kind of the first time I'd experienced someone at least in front of me have that happen. And it happens a couple of times after that as well. And just knowing how to sort of deal with that. And because obviously it's a highly embarrassing situation for some people. And then I think one of the worst I've spoke to lately is a lady who's had 2 kids. And if she even runs after her kids, like they run out the door, like she'll just stop weeing straight away, just like wet herself as she's walking out. And it's, doesn't seem to be getting the help that she needs as well, even off going to see the doctor and speaking to people that she is being advised to speak to.
I think what's really interesting, and we're slowly getting more and more research about, is that personal trainers, GPs, some physios are really nervous to talk to people about these topics because it's so taboo and you're not supposed to mention it, and what if they're offended and all these things. But actually there's more and more research that women want to be asked. They want to be asked exactly like you do. Are we okay to jump? Do you have any problems with leaking? Are you worried about it? And actually in the right setting, they want to be asked about their sex lives too. Because if things aren't going well, they don't know where to get the help. They don't know what they should be doing. Whereas if you're in the health and wellness space, they're coming to you for training, you're a really good person to say, do you know what, actually, this isn't my area of expertise, but I know exactly how to get you the help that you want so that you don't need to worry about this anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm so pleased that you told me that, because that tells me that maybe we need to be a little bit careful with our workouts until we're sure that your pelvic floor is working well, and taking this sting out of that conversation and just making it be like, well, yeah, that's great that you've told me.
Yeah.
And exactly like you did, we don't need to make it a huge deal.
Not at all.
Just need to get the support.
That's what I found. I used to get a lot of feedback that I was the first male that they'd ever spoken to about their menstrual cycle. And I was just like, yeah, do you track your cycle? And, sometimes it'd be yes, sometimes it'd be no. And we just would have open conversations about their menstrual cycle, about their period, to the point where they'd come on and be like, I'm due on, can we not do some lower body exercises today? I'm like, sure, we'll just work around it. So it's like you automatically create like a bit more of a connection through that, because you've got a little bit more empathy for the situation that person's in. But after the first like initial like raised eyebrow, like, did he really just ask me that? After that, it's just like, it just becomes normal straight away, and they feel, really comfortable to talk about it. And to the fact that they're speaking about their menstrual cycle or their pelvic floor health with you, but probably not even sometimes speaking to their partner or husband about that. Yeah.
There's loads of people specifically around the perimenopause, menopause, they might be having loads of problems with their pelvic health. They might be having problems with lots of pelvic pain or vaginal dryness, or sort of generally just really low libido, and they don't tell their partner because it's just so taboo, and they end up in, really sexless marriages and really frustrated about it. And then actually, they meet the right person, whether that is their GP, someone like me, their PT, and then they realise there's quite a lot they can do, and they're like, wow, actually, this is going to be fine. And then they start talking to their partner, and their partner's like, well, thank God, I thought you didn't fancy me anymore. And it's like, no, I fancied you the whole time. I just didn't know how to tell you that it's A, B, or C. And so I think the more we can have these conversations and the more it's spoken about, the better and easier it is for women and men to talk about their pelvic health. Because a lot of it is language. Like, what's very interesting is that for men, we know the words for most of the male genitalia. People know there's a penis, there's a testicle, there's all the testicles, there's all these things. We just call everything for a woman a vagina. Everything is just the vagina. And actually, most people don't really want to say the word vagina. So we say front, bottom, or downstairs, or lady region. And it's like, why? Like, it's just anatomy. Like, we can talk about our elbows and our knees and our ears. Like, 50% of the population has one.
But it's the same with bowel movements and stuff as well. There's just a lot of, taboo and embarrassment about it. Like, I think anytime we've actually posted stuff about bowel health online, we just like, next day, 2,000 followers gone. And I'm just like, we literally posted the
everybody poos.
Yeah, we're like, there's just the Bristol stool chart.
And actually, loads of people are having problems. Loads of people are having difficulties with their bowels. People also don't really know what's normal. So it's really interesting. One of the things that I get asked all the time is, I don't know, is it normal that this happens or that this happens? And I think a big reason why people don't go and get help is because they don't actually know, is it a problem or not? Yeah. And so actually knowing what's normal is really, really key. And because then if you're not normal or you have a dysfunction, you can go and get help. And if it is normal, you don't need to worry about it anymore. So, for example, with the bladder, it's completely normal to go for a wee every 3 to 4 hours. You shouldn't feel really urgent, especially even if you put your key in the door or you run water or you get in the shower. You shouldn't suddenly feel like you're going to leak. You shouldn't leak at any point. And it should be easy to empty your bladder. You shouldn't have to push to pee. And in terms of your bowel, you should be going between 3 times a day to 3 times a week. And it should be soft and formed and easy to pass without any straining. And when it comes to sex and intimacy, it should be pain-free, should be enjoyable. You should be able to put things inside the vagina without there being any obstruction or pain or dryness. And sex should be fun. So if you are able to climax, it should feel satisfying. You shouldn't get there and think, that was a bit overrated. And there shouldn't be pain ever. So there shouldn't be pain with smear tests, there shouldn't be pain inserting tampons, shouldn't be pain with intimacy, shouldn't be pain when you skip or lift weights or run. And actually knowing that all of these things are a sign that maybe there's something we can optimize in your pelvis means that you then can go and get the help, rather than thinking, oh, well, my partner says he goes to the toilet every day and I only go every 3 days. Maybe I'm constipated. Well, not necessarily if it's easy, if it's soft and you're not worried about it. Yep. So knowing your normals is really, really key.
Sorry to interrupt, just a quick ask. If you are enjoying today's episode, please do give us a follow or a subscribe so that we can keep bringing you excellent content and getting extra guests on to bring you all the value that you've come to know and love from the BodySmart podcast.
I mean, so one of the things that we push massively being a health and wellness company is to drink a lot of water. Yeah. Upwards of 2 to 3 liters and more if you're super active and you're in a hot climate. So I don't know, when you said 4 hours then, or every 4 hours to go to the toilet, I think some at least of our clients would be like, hey, I drink like 2 liters of water in a workout and then I have a coffee and then I'm going, and like even myself included, that at least the amount of liquids I consume in the morning, I'm sometimes going like every hour probably.
So this is an interesting one. So lots and lots of people really push that we need to really hydrate. And that's so good because most people are dehydrated. Yeah. But it's interesting that from a physiological perspective, as long as your urine output is above 1.3 litres, you don't need to drink anymore. Because actually, the more you drink isn't going to necessarily change anything that much. You're just going to wee it out. And so if your urine output is really, really high, that can lead to overactive bladder, increased emptying, going too often, because actually there's just so much there. And so working out, well, actually, is there a purpose to drinking more? If drinking more means that you have more energy, that you are able to concentrate better, that you feel like you are fully hydrated, your urine is a light straw colour, that's great, perfect. If you've already hit that, is drinking an extra litre going to give you any benefit, or is it just going to make your urine more dilute? And so getting that balance right is a very personalised thing. We used to tell everybody that you have to drink X amount, and that can be useful as like broad advice, like you say, to make sure that people are roughly drinking enough. And we want to make sure that people are not dehydrated, because that's really key. But actually anything above that, people aren't dehydrated when they look at the studies, and you can drink even more and it won't change your stool consistency, and you can drink even more and it won't change your blood pressure, and you can drink even more and it doesn't change lots of different things. So that balance is really important. But also, you mentioned coffee.
Yeah.
Coffee is a really strong bladder irritant in
is.
some people. So we used to tell everybody with an overactive bladder, cut caffeine.
Yeah.
Which is miserable, especially if you've got 2 young children, you've got no sleep. But we actually know now that in some people it's a really big problem. So a bit like I can have a cup of tea and go to bed and sleep all night. But I might click the kettle on at work at 2 o'clock and someone will be like, Jo, what are you doing?
That'll be
You're
me.
not going to be able to sleep. Some people are really sensitive and some people aren't. So for people who have urgency or are going a lot or are worried about their bladder, it's really good to just do a trial. Cut caffeine for a week or so. If you suddenly notice that your urgency has reduced, everything is working a lot better, maybe you're one of those people, and when you're worried
that's definitely me.
Yeah.
So I will drink probably about 2 litres of water probably within the first two hours of waking up. And that's because I'll wake up, I'll drink the half a glass of water that I've had from the bedside table, and then I'll maybe drink 1.5 litres while working out. And I will work out like pretty intense. I'm like sweating profusely throughout that. And I'm fine, nothing. Then half an hour, 45 minutes later, I'll have a cup of coffee, just like down on the toilet, and I'm going again 45 minutes later. It's definitely the coffee, because I've trialed having no coffee, and I don't need to go for a couple of hours after that. But it's the second I have the coffee, and I do almost, like you're saying, feel like almost a sense of urgency. So it's what I know. I'm very aware that it's the coffee causing the urgency for me to then feel like I
actually use the coffee if I'm like, I really need to go to the loo because I'm going to have to go on a 3-hour train. I'm like, number 2. I'm going to have a coffee, a double espresso now.
Yeah.
And it will do its job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really strong bowel irritant as well. So that's why it gets everything moving, which is why lots of people use it to empty their bowels in the morning. So that's why, we don't need to demonize caffeine and say having a coffee is terrible. And there's some days where, like you say, you work out, you have a coffee, then you're in the office. It's fine. If you need a wee, you can go. But if, let's say it's your wedding.
Is there negatives to that though? So like what I just said there, like in the sense, like is it bad that it's causing me to almost...
I think it depends on how we look at it. So if you are having coffee and it's meaning that you are then going for a wee every 45 minutes and then you're having coffee frequently throughout the day, and then your bladder sort of learns that going for a wee every 45 minutes is its new normal. And even if you don't have the coffee, it still keeps that as a habit. Then we're starting to think it's a bit of a problem.
Right.
So one of the ways we can look after the bladder is drinking enough water, as we've mentioned, avoiding bladder irritants sort of most of the time, so not relying on having lots and lots of coffees all the time. Other irritants can be things like artificial sweeteners or really sugary drinks, acidic drinks like fruit juice, some herbal teas, carbonated drinks, because it turns the urine more acidic, which irritates the bladder lining, but also not drinking enough can irritate the bladder. So if we're constantly irritating the bladder to the point that it makes it a bit twitchy, that's not good habits to get into. It's going to mean that we go more often. We're going to go just in case because we're worried about urgency. And if we're then getting to the point where you're so urgent, you're worried about leaking, we're very much in the territory of pelvic floor dysfunction. If it happens to be that you've drank loads that morning, you had a coffee, and then you go for 3 wees in the next 3 hours because that coffee was really strong, you're probably not going to do yourself any harm.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
And when it comes to, obviously, that's one end of the extreme of like, should I go all the time? What about people who hold it in? Because there is like, people say, oh, you shouldn't hold it in, it's really bad for you. What's your take on that?
So I think, again, it's a bit of a balance. So we don't need to, when we get a first feeling that we need to go for a wee, we don't necessarily need to go, especially if we know that there's not that much in there, we haven't drank that much. It's okay to ignore a first urge as long as it's not uncomfortable, that feeling goes away, we're sort of relatively unbothered by it. And that sort of having that first sensation, it going away, having another sensation, and then if we don't go there at that point, getting a stronger sensation, that's quite normal. And we tend to find that with people who overhold the bladder, so a really, really common time was nurses, and especially during COVID with PPE, not being able to come off the unit because you weren't allowed to because of your PPE. So you had to hold for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. And then because of that, the bladder stops sending you any signals, because the more signals it sends, it stops telling you that you need a wee. And that means that the bladder might fill to 800 mils, 900 mils, and then suddenly it thinks, oh, there's a lot in here, and it sends you a big message that you have to go really urgent. And if you leak, there's a lot to leak.
Yeah.
So actually trying to have this roughly every 3 to 4 hours, making sure you're drinking enough, making sure that if you have had one urge and then you get another urge later and it's a good time to going for a wee, and making sure that, you know, each time you go for a wee, it's a decent volume, then that's a good sign that we're in the right area.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to balance with real life, isn't it? Because I've had clients who've said, oh, I didn't hit my water goal yesterday because I was going out shopping for the day and I didn't want to have to go to the toilet whilst I was out. Which in my head, I'm like, I feel awful if I don't drink enough water. So I would just find a toilet, even if it was a rough one. But if people have got that experience where they know, actually, I'm going to have this really unpleasant sensation all morning if I have that bottle of water. So I'd rather just feel dehydrated than have the constant urgency.
So this is, again, another really interesting one that loads of people who come to see me with bladder problems say, oh, well, I just don't drink because then I know I'm going to need a wee. I have one sip and then I need a wee.
Wow.
And the problem is that actually being dehydrated makes your urine more concentrated, and then that irritates the bladder. So for some people who have more urgency and a more overactive bladder, drinking more actually dilutes the urine so that it's less likely to be irritating. Therefore, you're over time less likely to have an overactive bladder. So actually, it's although it sounds really counterintuitive, making sure that you're drinking enough is really important.
It sounds like a lot of the broad spectrum of stuff that we talk about with health and wellness anyway. It's all about finding what works for you. And that's because, you know, for some people, drinking too much, not drinking enough, because you know, some of the advice sounds almost like, well, if I drink too much, then I could have overactive bladder, but if I don't drink enough, I could have an overactive bladder.
Very much so.
It is finding what works for you.
And that's why I often tell people to just look at your wee. If your wee is light and straw coloured, you're good. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. You know, if it looks dark, then you're dehydrated. That's
a great sign as well for your urine and your stools. Is basically just like, it's a great sign to look at your health. I'd even say, like, with your menstrual cycle as well, having a regular cycle. These are all signs your body is telling you, like, hey, like, we're doing okay.
Yeah, hormonally we're good.
Yeah, you know, and when we're starting to see differences in urine, stool, possibly changes in menstrual cycle or losing your period, you know, these are certain signs that your body's saying, like, hey, like, something's not quite right here. Yeah, pay it. Exactly. Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that we were chatting on email about was around some of these trending solutions to pelvic floor challenges. Could you share your opinion on those?
Yeah, so I think there's quite a lot of devices that are heavily advertised to specifically postnatal women, which are potentially problematic, but also can be useful. So I think the idea of using devices is more and more common now because people can buy it themselves. They don't need to tell anyone about it. It can arrive in a discreet package, and then theoretically, the branding says that it's going to solve all of your leaking. So a really good example is something like a biofeedback machine. So that normally involves a vaginal device, which you put inside the vagina. You do your pelvic floor contractions, and then it tells you on an app what's happening. And theoretically, that sounds great. But in real life, there's a few problems with it. So a really common one is the LV.
Yeah, so there's like the LV, the Kegel, the
Yeah, so the ones which just give you feedback, the LV is probably one of the better ones. It's got a triaxial dynamometer in it, which means that it's the most accurate in telling, are you bearing down, are you squeezing, are you relaxing fully? But it's not hugely reliable.
And it's super expensive.
Super expensive. And the other challenge with it is that it can be linked to a game. So it, like, as you squeeze, a bunny hops over a hill or the plane goes over the clouds or whatever. The thing is, doing a good pelvic floor contraction takes quite a lot of brain power. And so if you're then completely distracted by trying to get this bunny to hop up the mountain or get points or whatever, then often people lose form. It's kind of like, you know, like classes where you have to do really heavy lifts repetitively. If you don't have the right training beforehand, you're going to hurt yourself. It's important you know what you're doing before you go into that environment. And it's the same with something like the LV. So if I had somebody who has come to see me, we've got their pelvic floor working really well, they're really confident, there's no problems, there's no symptoms, hasn't been for a few months, and they say, oh, Joe, I just can't keep on top of this is really boring. I'll say, well, would you be interested in trying something like this? Because it might help with motivation. Is it useful at any other time? Probably not.
Yeah.
Right.
Another one that's really interesting is like Kegel balls. this was really common around like after 50 Shades of Grey, because you can use them during sex and it's all quite naughty. But also you can use them in the medical world. So they're basically like little weighted balls, or we call them vaginal cones, and you put them in the vagina and they're supposed to strengthen the pelvic floor. And again, they're quite controversial, because if your muscles are tight and you use a vaginal cone or a Kegel ball, then what happens is that it's going to make the muscles more tight because they're trying to hold that ball in the whole time. If the muscles are really weak, then it just falls out, and that is really demoralizing, because you suddenly think that everything is a lot worse than it is. And so they're not that useful. Again, they might be really useful. I might use them under really close guidance. Let's say I've seen somebody, they were leaking loads, and then we've got them to being able to do 20 double unders before they start leaking. And so we know, okay, this is an endurance thing, because their form must be good, their breathing must be good, otherwise they would leak in the first 20. But they're getting tired. You might use them then, almost like adding resistance training to another exercise, but it's under very close guidance. So you want to make sure that you've definitely got the right bit of kit for the right thing you need. Another really interesting one is things like the Kegel. So they are stim machines. So they literally zap the muscle, it makes them fire, and then you relax afterwards. And the idea is to help get the muscle stronger. There is not many people who need that bit of kit, because if you get it activating well, strengthening well, know what you're doing, have the right cues, are in the right position, are breathing well, you shouldn't need that. And often people who come to see me have tried it and it's made things a lot worse. So if you're going to use it, they've definitely got a place. So for people who have absolutely no muscle activation at all, I might use it for a very short period of time to help them find it. But I would be very, very cautious about throwing your money at these devices, which often don't have.
So could we, like, because there's so many like devices and different techniques and different, you know, like, could you give me like an example of like who would be like a typical, if there is a typical pelvic floor patient or client, and then like some of the steps that you would get them to take? So if anyone was like listening, they could be like, oh, there's some action steps that I could maybe start to take to see some improvements, instead of maybe relying on like a device because it's got great marketing behind it.
For sure. So I think if you've got any problems with your pelvis at all, whether it's pain, bladder, bowel, doesn't matter. If you are constipated, it's going to make everything worse. So having enough fibre is really important. Drinking enough fluids is really important. And I always recommend putting your feet up on a footstool when you're emptying your bowel, because that's the better physiological position.
I've got one of these in our house. And literally, I have when people come round, they like laugh, but like, we got to...
It's how we should all be doing it.
Yeah. Squatty potty for the win.
Squatty potty for the win. So that's really key. And actually that by itself can make a huge difference to lots of pelvic floor symptoms. The other thing is, if you've got any bladder problems, reducing those irritants and making sure you're drinking enough. So that's going to mean that your bladder and your bowel is in a better position. The next thing is to think about your posture. Are you the kind of person that grips through the jaw, grips through the tummy, grips through your buttocks? Can you think about letting that go throughout the day? Just sort of actually monitor yourself and becoming a little bit less pelvic centric and thinking just a little bit bigger to see what we can change from the wider perspective. For anyone that's listening, they might not be like, oh, I don't clench my bum or whatever. But I do think a lot of women do to kind of like hold things in place. Mm-hmm. And particularly if you're conscious that like your tummy's sticking out a bit and your posture's not very good, like you're often told, oh, squeeze your glutes because you've got weak glutes and that's why. And then it just becomes this grip. Yeah. And I think everybody is told they have weak glutes forever. It's blamed for literally everything. And yes, lots of people do have weak glutes. But if weak glutes were blamed for, if they literally were the driver of all issues, then we'd all have stronger glutes from an evolutionary perspective. So I think, yes, you're completely right. People get told to tuck their pelvis under, hold your tummy in. That will help have good posture. But we know that posture isn't necessarily a problem for most people. Different postures don't cause back pain. They don't cause hip pain. They just make us look different and move different. But if that's how you've moved your whole life and there's no problems, we don't need to change it. So avoiding sort of gripping anywhere is really, really key. I think as well, in terms of what can people do if they're worried about their pelvis, is actually just to do their own self-check of their pelvic floor. So first of all, if they're just sitting, can they feel tension within their pelvis? Can they feel tension around their back passage? If they squeeze their back passage and then relax it, is there more to relax than there was at the beginning? And if they squeeze, can they hold for a very long time and still relax? What is that movement like? And then if they want to check at their pelvic floor squeezes in a woman, it's really easy to do. You can either pop either a finger or a thumb inside the vagina and you should feel a squeeze, almost like it's pulling your thumb inside the body. Or you can have a look with a mirror and you should be able to see that the perineum, so the skin in between the vagina and the back passage, should be moving inwards when you squeeze and back to baseline when you're relaxing. So if you can't do any of those things, that's a really good sign that maybe we need to start thinking about either the relaxing element or thinking about the squeezing element. And then making sure that actually we're moving and we're strong and we're keeping ourselves exercising, because the stronger we are, the less sedentary we are, the more active we are, the less likely we are to have bladder and bowel problems and less likely we are to have pelvic floor problems. So we know that actually being active, keeping your steps up, doing some exercise, following those activity guidelines are really, really key to optimizing your pelvic health. And most importantly, if there's a problem, go and see somebody.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of, and I know you'd only ask this question, Stacey, but it is our hashtag, which is like cutting the BS.
Yeah.
What are one or a couple of things that you would love to cut the bullshit with when it comes to pelvic floor health?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that it's never too late. So lots of people come and say, I had my baby 8 years ago. It must be too late for me now. And that's just not true. And we've got loads of research
sad.
for
like
that.
My auntie spoke to me about this probably about 5 years ago, and her youngest son is about 21, and she just thought that was it now. Like, I've had 2 babies. This is what happens.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it sad? Especially because women have babies quite young in our lifespan now. Like, we're living so much longer. It's a lot of years to have problems. And actually we know that there's loads of research that if we do the right things, it doesn't matter how old you are. I'm really for a proactive health sort of model. I love seeing women in pregnancy, before pregnancy, immediately after birth. I'll always offer a 2-week complimentary call to say, how are you getting on? Is there anything we need to do? And see them at 6 weeks. That is physiologically ideal. But actually, if you've had a really tricky birth, or your baby's been really unwell, or you're absolutely loving new mum life and enjoying all the snuggles, or really struggling with it and not really feeling yourself, is that the best time to come and see me? Are you going to listen to anything I say? Are you going to remember anything I've told you to do? No. Also, in that sort of early postnatal period, sometimes you don't have the finances or the availability or the headspace for it. And so it might be that 6 months later, 12 months later, 5, 8, 10 years later, your kids are in school and you suddenly think, do you know what? I've had enough of this. I've now got the money, the time, the energy and the willingness to go and invest in myself. And that's a great time to do it. So there's no time that's too late. I've had women who come to me in their 90s and they're scared to leave the house and they're really high risk of falls because they're rushing to the toilet because they need a wee so bad. Oh, wow. Yeah. And you get them dry and they're like, I'm actually going to go and join my new knitting group now. And I'm like, yeah, you go to knitting. Don't worry about your bladder. So it's definitely never too late. And so I think that's really important as a message to send out. Equally, on the complete other side, you don't have to have had babies for it to be a problem. I think loads of women put off coming to see me because they say, oh, well, I haven't had any babies, so I guess this is just it. And actually, we know there's so many factors that affect the pelvic floor. I see loads of women who are younger, maybe even teenagers, who are struggling with, they can't use a tampon, they can't tolerate a smear test, can't have sex even for the first time because they have something called vaginismus, where the vaginal opening has a spasm whenever penetration is attempted. And that means that then they get into this cycle of the more tense they feel about it, the more it's more bothersome. And actually, they've had no babies. They haven't even had sex yet. They can't have sex because of a pelvic floor problem. So I think as much as it's never too late, it's also never too early, because if you are worried about your pelvic health, it's really important that we get onto it early. And this idea that it's all to do with pregnancy, postnatal, perimenopause, if that was the case, I wouldn't see men. Yeah. So actually, we have to really acknowledge that it's just not as simple as that. And I think the other thing, just in terms of thinking about pregnancy and birth, a big myth that I see all the time, and loads of people say to me is, oh, don't worry, my pelvic floor's fine, I've had a cesarean. And I'm like, yeah, but you still had a baby. Yeah. You still carried the baby. There was still hormonal changes to the pelvic floor. You still had that abdominal wall separation. You still had all that extra weight coming down onto the pelvic floor, the changes to the bladder, the changes to the bowel, and you've now got a 10 centimetre scar going straight through your abdominal wall, which if we leave to its own devices could cause problems with your abdominal function, pelvic floor function, might cause pain sort of deep in the pelvis during intercourse. It might be tight and pull when you're doing exercise. So that's not something we should just leave be. There's loads we can do for that.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, really important too.
I think something that I learned when I was rehabbing, which blew my mind a bit, but makes a lot of sense, is the difference your hormones make to like your contraction function and the like softness in your fascia. And it was really disheartening in a way, but also reassuring when the pelvic health physio said, well, I'm going to be honest with you, whilst you're breastfeeding, your hormones are slightly different and it is going to be harder to get back to the same level of function as you had before. And part of me was like, that's so unfair. But then also you can kind of accept it a bit more because there's a reason. It's not that you're not doing enough rehab, you're not working hard enough. It's like you literally are physiologically different. You kind of need to accept that at the moment, this is where you're going to be.
Absolutely. And I think as well, when we think about training, we talk about the only training that's beneficial is the training that you can recover from. So we're talking about sleep, we're talking about protein, we're talking about all these sorts of things which mean that training is effective. And in that early postnatal period, we've got hormonal changes which aren't helping. We've got the fact that you're probably not sleeping very well. You're probably not prioritizing your own nutrition. And even if you are, that can't outweigh everything else. And your training's probably not going to be as effective because of interruptions and all these different things. So I think meeting yourself where you are is so key. And I hate this whole snap back culture that, 6 weeks postnatal, you're going to look amazing. But I also hate that sometimes people genetically, they do look great very early postnatal. And then people also criticize them. You just can't win.
You can't win.
Or they make comments that don't. So I had, I was very lucky. Like I didn't put much weight on when I was pregnant and I pretty much just like gave birth to all of my weight. And everyone was like, oh my God, you've got your body back. And I was like, no, like it doesn't work properly. It's like the outside does not tell the picture. And it was so frustrating because people would be like, oh, I'm so jealous. I'm like, well, you shouldn't be because I literally can't pick my child up without my bumhole falling out. So it's like the most frustrating thing that this expectation of what it looks like tells the whole story.
For sure. And a lot of these people who have a better sort of aesthetic recovery, we could say, so much of it's genetics. So
much of it is genetics.
Some of it is your training history. So, if you were very lean pre, you exercise really hard during pregnancy, and then postnatally you have everything in place to have the best rehab you can. That's going to influence. We can't say it's not all genetics. But actually, in terms of a diastasis, so that tummy gap during pregnancy, 100% of women will have it during pregnancy. And how likely you are for everything to go back to a new version of normal, so that smaller gap again, is predominantly genetic. And all the research shows us that every single factor we try and control for, it doesn't matter. The main thing is your connective tissue and your genetics. So yes, you can be very lean. Yes, you can work really hard, but you can't overcome some of these things and things like prolapse. So a prolapse is when one of the pelvic organs sits lower within the pelvis. So it could be the bladder, could be the bowel, could be the uterus, or for women who don't have a uterus, it could be the vaginal vault, so the top of the vagina, and it sits lower within the pelvis. And it causes symptoms of things like heaviness or dragging or feeling like there's a tampon in when there isn't, sometimes difficulty emptying the bladder or emptying the bowels, or when you look at the vaginal opening, some people might see a small vaginal bulge. And a huge myth that I just hate about prolapse is that some people literally get told they have a prolapse at their 6-week appointment. And they get told, right, so from now on you can't lift anything and you can't do any running and you can't do CrossFit ever again.
It's so damaging, and especially because people will look at someone in a white, in a white coat and be like, oh, okay, doctor, that's me, and they'll just go away and it's what the doctor said, and that's it. There's no second opinion. It's just they said that, and this is. And a lot of people go on for decades or the rest of their life having that belief, and it's.
Like the NHS pelvic physio told me, you shouldn't really carry your baby. I mean, we're not meant to walk around carrying 10 kilos. And I was like, we are?
Literally what mums do.
Literally are. After that, I didn't go back because I was like, I can't take anything you say seriously. But if you have that mindset as the person that's treating someone, oh, well, we can just adjust your life around this problem, it fixes the problem. But it doesn't resolve the life challenges for the person.
Yeah, and also this is the other thing I find really interesting about postnatal recovery. medical advice and training. So people will be like, yeah, absolutely fine. Pick your 2-year-old out of the cot and you're fine to put all of the bikes of all of your children in the boot of the car. You can carry the shop in. When you go to the gym, make sure you only pick up 3 kilos.
Yes.
I'm like, actually, right.
Yeah.
This also, because I argued back to the pelvic physio and I was like, but surely I should kind of be doing some progressive overload because at what point am I going to pick my child up? Am I going to go from never touching him to then picking up a 15-kilo toddler? Like, how is that going to be a good idea?
Yeah.
She didn't really have an answer for me. I don't think she liked me very much. But it's like we wouldn't say to somebody who's a beginner in the gym, yeah, don't touch anything, and then one day just come in and pick up a really heavy barbell because you'll be fine. You will have like got over it.
Yeah, and I think so. It's really sad that a few people come to me and they say, "Oh, I've been really putting it off because I just know you're going to tell me I have to stop running," and I'm like, "No."
Yeah.
I've actually just met you. I don't even know what your problem is yet. But, yeah, let's see what we can do. And often we'll change lots of things. So before I'll tell someone to not run, I'll say, let's say we've got someone who is 9 months postnatal. They've come to see me. They've tried to run, but they leak. And they leak all the time. But they're really enjoying running. It's the only time they can get away from the baby, get some exercise in. It's so good for their mental health. They're loving running, but they leak every time. And so they're like, am I doing damage? Should I not? Should I? This is all quite stressful. The first thing I'll say is, okay, well, let's look at you running. What do you run like?
Yeah.
Okay, if we get you breathing differently, does that change things? If we change your cadence, so how many times your feet hit the floor in a minute, does that reduce each impact? And therefore, does that change things? What if you lean forward more? What if we get you rotating more? What if we get you using your glutes more when you run? Does that change things? Okay. So you're either leaking not as quickly or not leaking as much. Okay, great. So we can start to work with that. It might be that we consider short-term using a small device, something like there's a vaginal device called Contrel, which is like a small foam vaginal insert, and it basically goes in, it supports the bladder neck. So during this time when we're working together, so that long-term you don't need that, actually, let's keep you running. It keeps you happy. Let's give you that support, let you do the running, and then in the meantime, we'll do all of the work working out, okay, let's get your pelvic floor good. Let's get on top of your constipation. Let's make sure you don't have any irritants in your diet. Let's work out what's actually the problem. And then over time, we'll wean off that support and then you can run.
Yeah.
There's not many times when I would say, actually, you need to stop. And even if I did, I might say, let's say, for example, with lifting, it is quite likely I might say, right, so you're in CrossFit and you're doing really heavy snatches. But I want to teach you a way to activate in a slightly different way. So I really want you to drop that weight really significantly, just whilst you get the hang of what I'm asking you to do, get used to it, and then we'll build back up to that weight. But it's never just stop.
It's no different than doing snatches and your form not being that good, but you've got used to doing a heavier weight. Any coach would say, hey, we need to drop your weight, we need to get your form in a better place, and then we'll start adding more weight back on because you'll be able to progress further.
Yeah.
But no, I like that because I think not just with pelvic health, with a lot of things, people get crutches. So they'll use a device, or they'll use something like a knee strap or something else. And then next minute you wear a knee strap for the next 40 years of your life, instead of just being like, hey, how can I actually rehab my knee so I don't need a strap anymore? And it's the same with like pelvic floor health. It's like you don't want to ever become reliant on a device or a certain anything. You want to make sure that you're taking the steps to be like, hey, like, I'm back to normal. But I think also probably understanding what normal is.
Very much so. And I think also the amount of people who just pad up and get on with it. So they say, well, I need to run. I'll just wear a tenner. And I think, some of these brands have done well because they've brought it out of being such a big taboo. People, there's like that advert where they're like, with my tenner, I can do whatever I like. And it's good that then people feel more confident to do things, and they can be useful for a period of time. So for example, these, some of the women who I've seen are really scared to leave the house. They're terrified they're going to leak. For example, your lady who had a really big leak, that is really crippling for a lot of people. Or for bowel incontinence, one bowel accident can be life-changing for years, because even if you don't have another accident, the fear of another accident is huge. So having that as a bit of a crutch short term, whilst you're doing all the hard work, can be really useful. But like you say, you haven't done your job if you don't get without it. A bit like I was saying, if your physio says, yeah, your pelvic floor is great in lying and discharges you, you've really missed a trick there. Because if you're not back to your goal and they haven't checked your pelvic floor when you're standing, if they haven't checked your pelvic floor when you're in a lunge, what about when you do a box jump? What about when you hop? What about you do all these things? If they don't know you're there, then you're not done.
So what is done?
I think it depends on what your goal is as to what done means. There's a really, really good return to running guidelines. So if you literally just Google return to running postnatal guidelines, it's the first thing that comes up on Google, and it's fantastic because it's a really long document, but it does go through all the different things you need to consider if you're going to go back to running. So things like pelvic floor strength, impact testing, strength testing, even talks about breastfeeding, the kind of buggy that you should be in when you can run with your baby, etc. From a pelvic floor perspective, in that guideline, it says that you need to be able to do certain things in standing to show that your pelvic floor is strong enough to run. So it says that in standing, you should be able to do 10 on and off squeezes through full range, so with a full relaxation.
What would full range be
so
considered
to be able
as?
to squeeze all the way on and then still relax it all the way back down again.
Okay.
So feeling like it's a really strong squeeze.
Mm-hmm.
You should be able to do around 10 8 to second 12 maximal squeezes. So at 12 seconds maximal squeezes. So again, a full squeeze, holding for 8 to 12 seconds and relaxing all the way back down. And also to be able to do a sub-maximal squeeze for a whole minute in standing and then relax the whole way. And so that's really challenging to do that in standing. And that is just an indicator that you can consider a return to running program. So that's not even running, that's starting something like Couch to 5K. So I think when we consider what is done, we have to consider fully achieving your goals, symptom-free for a good couple of months. But even then, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're fully ticked off. So let's say you were back to running, you were back to the weights you were doing beforehand, and you were feeling pretty strong. But then 2 years postnatally, you wanted to really up your training. You're going to change your nutrition, you're going to change your training program, and you wanted to really up the ante. It might be a really good time to actually go back to your pelvic floor physio and say, previously I had X, Y, and Z. We worked really hard on this. I think it's going really well. Can we check that we're still doing the right thing? Is there any bad habits that I've learned or picked up, or anything I need to consider now that my goal is so much bigger? I think postnatal, people sort of say 9 months to grow a baby, 9 months to recover. But actually postnatal is exactly what it says. It's after baby. It's forever. So if you didn't do your postnatal rehab in that first year, first 2 years, and you start at age 47, you're still going to have to go back to the things that you need to do at the beginning, the basics, core strength, pelvic floor strength, balance, stability, global muscle training, to actually make sure that you're strong enough to do the things you want to do. So I think instead of thinking of it as like a tick box or like I'm now done and not postnatal anymore, it's more thinking about, okay, well, what can I do which is symptom-free? Can I do everything I want to do symptom-free? Have I been able to do that for a while? Yes, maybe I'm done for now. But if my goals change, or if my body changes, or if I have another baby, or if I go to perimenopause, things change. A bit like how, let's say you previously ran marathons and you had no pelvic floor problems. You didn't do a marathon for 10 years and you want to go again. You wouldn't just assume that your body can do it because it could do it then. Our bodies are changing feats all the time. And I think it's important to remember that there's never any harm in popping back to your physio and saying, is everything still good? I think it's good. Do you think it's going well too? And then they can say, yeah, you're great, crack on, lift heavy, run faster, do whatever you want to do. Or they might say, oh, there's a few things we could change here before we do that to make sure that you have the best outcome and feel really empowered rather than scared to do the next thing.
Yeah.
And is it something that you kind of need to do maintenance, like prehab on? Because I know one of the things, I've got a physio friend who gets really irate that he gives people exercises. They do it whilst the problem is there, and then they stop, and then the problem comes back. So is this a similar kind of thing?
So I think lots of the guidelines say you should be doing pelvic floor muscle training forever, for life, every day. I just don't think it's that realistic for people to expect to do that throughout life. And people say it's like brushing your teeth, and it is, that we should be looking after our pelvic health and considering our pelvic health all the way through life. But actually, if we do the basics at the beginning, so we get the pelvic floor working well, we get good coordination with the breath, the core's really strong, and we've achieved our goals, and then we continue to exercise, thinking about those principles, breathing well, engaging well, thinking about our pelvic floor when we do those exercises, why would we need to continue doing loads and loads of focused exercises when for some people there's a risk of doing them wrong or all these sorts of things? So I think it's more important that people just exercise and think about the principles. And then I do say every couple of weeks, you should do your maximal program that you achieve with your pelvic floor. So let's say at the beginning, you were able to do X, Y, and Z. Every couple of weeks, check. Can you still do it? If you can still do it, great. All the stuff you're doing in the gym is working. If you suddenly think, that didn't feel quite as good as last time, maybe go back to the program that you were sent before. And if you can build it back up yourself, great. Or if you suddenly think, I've forgotten what I was meant to be doing here, or this doesn't feel the same, or I can't relax anymore, or I've lost that coordination, get back in touch with the person that helped you the first time, just to make sure that we are maintaining, but not constantly having to think about every single day doing 10 sets of 10-second holds in 5 different positions, which is just not realistic.
Definitely. And I think one of the things that really resonated with me is if you are feeling that things have slipped back, it's not a big drama. Just go back to what you were doing before and you will build it back up. And I think that's really empowering because you know you've got to that strong point and it's just a case of maintenance.
Very much so. And I think the pelvic floor is like all other muscles. It's muscle memory. So if you have done all the graft at the beginning and you've really mastered that coordination of how to engage, how to do it with your breath, how to do it with your abdominal wall, how to do that during your different exercises, squat, deadlift, overhead press, it will just happen. You might need to think about it a bit more at the beginning, but it will come back. Whereas if you've sort of had a baby, done a few odd squeezes because the midwife told you to, weren't really sure what you were doing, didn't get any check, started running and thought, oh, lucky me, I was okay, I wonder if I'm doing any damage, and then just cracked on, then you're not going to feel anywhere near as confident and as empowered to do whatever the next goal is than if you really put the graft in at whatever stage you're ready to, undertake it as like a bit of a project. It's interesting, a lot of the women I work with are doing quite a lot of training, and they say, right, and I say, well, great, show me what you're doing. And then I realise that they're leaking because of X, Y, and Z, or they're having heaviness or pain or whatever. And then I say, okay, well, let's change the way that you do that. And they say, God, these bicep curls are so much harder now. And I'm like, yeah, because now we're using your whole body, and actually now that that's working better, your biceps can work better, or your overhead press is better. We've changed your form. So actually, we don't need to just think about the benefit within the pelvic floor and it all seem very boring. This can actually make your whole training program better. It can mean that you're moving in a way that's more effective and that you feel you're getting more out of it. So we don't need to think of it as just something for your pelvis, but actually something that can help your whole body and your whole training for life.
That's very exciting. It makes me want to come and hang out with you at the gym for a bit. So if somebody has been listening to the episode and has thought, you know what, actually, I might need to get some help from the sounds of this, what should they do? Where should they look? Where should they start?
For sure. So I think it's always good to speak to the GP, check there's nothing sinister going on. If they need to refer you to anyone to rule out anything nasty, then they can do that. The slight challenge with the GPs at the moment is that because they're really tight for time, often the place they'll refer you first is to consultants like urogynae, colorectal. And if you go and see a surgeon, they will recommend surgery. Or if you go and see someone who prescribes medications, they will recommend medication. And that's not necessarily a bad thing at the right time, but really advocating that you want to go and see a pelvic health physiotherapist either alongside or instead of or as a first step is something I would really, really push for. And there's NHS physiotherapists across the UK. And depending on where you are, there might be quite a long waiting list or not such a long waiting list. If it's something that you are able to do, you can go private. And if you go onto the POGP website, there's a bit called Find a Physio, and you can literally just look at who are the nearest physios to you. You can reach out, and I'd always contact them first and say, these are the sort of things I'm worried about. Can you help with that? Because not all physios are specialists in exactly the same thing. So some people specialise loads in bladder health or postnatal, but don't know much about bowels or vice versa. So if you've got something specific, make sure you're seeing the right person. And then you can go and see them and they'll be able to help you with whatever it is. And if they find that actually that you need support from someone else, then you can refer on. So I refer to loads of different people. So I might refer to urogynae or colorectal or the surgeons or the consultants if I think maybe they do need more scans or tests or medication. I also might refer to talking therapy. So for people with pelvic pain or erectile dysfunction, I often refer to psychosexual therapy to make sure that we're not just addressing a problem with intimacy just as a purely biomechanical problem, when it's so intrinsically linked with our psyche and how we feel and our emotions and thoughts about sex and intimacy. So referring out can go both ways. So someone can refer you to a physio, but a physio can also refer you out. And so obviously I'm going to advocate for physio because I am one. But I do think it's a really good starting point because it means that your physio will have access to whoever it is that you need, and they can refer you to the right people at the right time, rather than it being overwhelming and then a long wait on the NHS to meet someone who isn't the right person for you.
Definitely. And if somebody did want to find you or find out more about your work, where can they go?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram as Jo Gipson Physio, or I've got a website, jogipsonphysiotherapy.com. And I offer complimentary calls because often when I do things like this, people are like, oh, I don't know if that's me. I don't know if she can help me. And so sometimes just having a quick call and saying, you were the person I was talking about on that podcast. Let's get you in, can be really helpful. So if anybody's interested or wants to reach out, then please do.
Amazing. And you do virtual and in person, which is good to know.
Yeah, so I'm in Newcastle upon Tyne, so I have a clinic there, and I also do home visits, but loads of the work I do is online, and we can have fantastic outcomes through working through that medium.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming down today. It's been a great episode. I think Jamie's learnt a lot.
I've learnt a lot, definitely. I mean, the male side of it is just huge for me as well, just because, again, no guys speak about this ever. But no, it's been fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
If you've been listening to the Body Smart podcast, you will know we work with women on a one-to-one basis. Now, our goal is for you to become a Body Smart graduate, and that means we help you hit your weight loss goal, but most importantly, we help you develop the skills, habits, and traits to make a sustainable change so you never gain that weight back. If you're interested and you're ready, willing, and able, we can guarantee that we will get you results. You can find out more with the link in the description.